Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gaia Education's webinar series. This time it is focused on sustainable development and design. My name is Giovanni Charlo, and I'm your host for this online experience, which I am sure will be of great value as we explore the many issues related to the EDE curriculum developed by Gaia Education and its founders. We are honored today to have Russ Jackson with us. He is a Gaia Education board member and a founding GEES. He is also an author, world expert on economics, a social responsible entrepreneur, and a generous philanthropist. Ross will be presenting today his work on economic transformation and a framework that he has created for shifting the global economy to sustainability, which he will explain in detail in a moment. Economic issues around equality, equity, and access are some of the most urgent problems of our time. And we enter the age of sustainability as we exceed the Earth's carrying capacity. We cannot afford to ignore this critical issue. That is why we bring you this webinar today. The GEES, by the way, stands for Global Ecovillage Educators for a Sustainable Earth. And that is what the Gaia Education founders and contributors call themselves. This topic is covered in the economic dimension of our curriculum, and we bring it to you as a complement to course materials offered worldwide. We have, for some references, we have publications that you can see on the screen. I would like to point out that you can find downloadable versions of the full EDE curriculum, along with our many other publications and course listings on our website, GaiaEducation.net, that I think you can see it here, yes, at the bottom. Gaia Education certified courses are also offered throughout the world and online in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. You can access information and registration at the address you see on the screen in just a moment when the slide moves. The Spanish version of this online course is offered as a postgraduate diploma from the Open University of Catalonia in Spain. Please visit our website for more information on that. And there you can see the programs that we have for offer. You can also follow us on our social media sites by going to the links that I will show on the screen right there. And well, a little housekeeping about this webinar. You will have audio and video on your screen if you downloaded the Fuse application to your computer or to a handheld device. Otherwise, you can call in from your telephone at the number provided in your registration confirmation. You can use the chat box in the Fuse screen to post your questions. The chat box has a little oval icon that you can find on your screen. You won't see the chat, but the presenters will. It would be best if you have any other applications closed on your computer while you attend the webinar so you can get the best streaming quality. And the webinar will be recorded and available for download later on. We'll post that on our website, and you can reference it later on or pass it on to other friends that have missed the webinar today. So without further ado, I would like to give Russ Jackson a welcome and introduce you to shifting the global economy to sustainability. Welcome, Russ.
Hello, Gio. Great to be here.
Let me see, I'll post. Good. So you have the floor, Russ.
Thanks very much. Now, this first diagram is showing the title side of my recent book called Occupy World Street. And I'm showing this because my talk today is going to be based primarily on this particular book. But before we get into the actual guts, I'd like to say a few words about my background. If we could just have the next chart. See, I have a rather strange background in that I have roughly equal time spent in my career on grassroots projects and on international corporate projects. From below, you might say that much of my work has been connected with both Gaia Education and GEN, the Global Eco-Village Network, and also with green technologies and permaculture and so forth, trying to develop a more sustainable world by working from below with the grassroots. But one of the things I learned after about 25 years with this approach is that it's not enough. We are simply not strong enough at the grassroots level to create the kind of global changes that are necessary. And this is one of the reasons that I wrote this book, Occupy World Street. In this book, I'm taking the top-down look. I'm looking at what kind of allies could we possibly find at the level of the nation state that might be able to work with the grassroots in order to create change. Now, I'd like to show this next diagram about the Occupy movement to illustrate how important a message that it came with recently. If you look at these two charts, we'll notice that the top one is showing the growth in income in the period 1950 to 1978 in the United States for 5 different income groups, from the lowest to the highest 20%. Note how the distribution of income increases was fairly uniform in this period. In fact, the lowest 20% had the greatest income increase. Now look at the table below. This is the period from 1979 to 2005. Here we see that the increases in income for the different groups are radically different. In fact, it is the lowest 20% had almost no increase, while the top 20% had a 75% increase in income. And if we look at the top 1%, they had a 200% increase, and the top 0.1%, 390%. So what the Occupy movement has put in front of us is this whole question of the tremendous inequality in income in the United States and everywhere, and it's just not a sustainable development. This next diagram is even more dramatic. This is showing the wealth distribution, not for the United States, but in fact globally. If you look at the left of the chart, we see the total income of the poorest people, the lowest 0.11% and so forth. And as we go to the right, we see the income of the richest people in the world. Now, this is very, very dramatic. In fact, the wealth distribution is even more extreme than the income distribution. For example, the wealthiest 1% globally own 43% of all the wealth, while the lowest 80%, that's 8 out of 10, together own no more than 6%. This is extremely skewed. In fact, if we look at it in more detail on the right side of the diagram, the 0.1 to 0.01%, we find that 300 multi-billionaires have as much wealth as almost half the world population, 300 billion people. 300 people own as much as 300 billion people. So this is one of the major global problems that we have to look at. This is not a situation that can be sustainable in the long run. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through some 3 major measures of what has been happening over the last 30 years in the social area, in the ecological area, environmental area, and finally in the economic area, in order to define what the problems really are. If we start with this diagram on the social costs, this is a diagram of the so-called Gini coefficient, which is a recognized, broadly used measure of inequality. Now note how on the right-hand part of the graph, after 1980, it begins to increase very, very substantially. Keep that in mind as we go further. Now this diagram here is a follow-up to the former diagram showing a statistical relationship between, on the vertical axis, a measure of health problems, and on the horizontal axis, a measure of inequality. What we see here is that the industrial states with the greatest inequality also have the worst health problems, while those who have a more equal society, a more egalitarian society, have the best health. In fact, if you look at the right part of the diagram, at the very top, we see the United States, which has the highest inequality of all the industrialized countries and the worst health problems. Not only that, but it has the highest cost per capita in the health sector. So for the United States to become a more egalitarian society, it would not only have a happier populace and a healthier populace, but it would be saving enormous amounts of money in the health sector. By the way, note how on the left part of the diagram, the countries that have the lowest health problems, the least health problems, and the least inequality are the Scandinavian countries and Japan. Let's move on now to the environmental measure. This chart here is showing the so-called global ecological footprint for the whole world, which is to say how many resources are we using relative to the Earth's capacity. The green line shows what corresponds to one planet. And if we go back about 50 years, we were using roughly 50% of the total capacity for renewable resources on the planet. And around 1990, we hit the point where the two curves cross. This is where we were using 100%. Today, we're up to about 150% of capacity, which means that we are, in a sense, sawing off the branch that we're sitting on. We are destroying the basis for our existence here on this planet. And what, in concrete terms, what is happening is that we're using up the waste depots, like we're putting CO2 into the atmosphere and into the oceans at a rate that they cannot absorb. This is why we're having climate change, by the way. So this is a curve which, if it continues, can only lead to one final result, and that is the destruction of our civilization. That's how serious this is. Now, this next diagram is showing the economic development over the last 30 or so years, and in fact, it goes back 50 years. The upper curve is a measure of the gross domestic product in the United States, and it shows a fairly regular increase since about 1950 back up to 2005 and the present also. The curve below is a so-called genuine progress indicator, which is an adjusted form of gross domestic product where we deduct all the negative factors. And so in the gross national product or gross domestic product, we include not only the things which are beneficial to us, but we also include all the negative things, like more highway accidents, more high costs for the health sector, more pollution to clean up, and so forth. And if we deduct all these negative things, we find that in fact our net well-being, which is shown by the genuine progress indicator, has not really improved since about 1970. In fact, the curve is actually slightly declining. This suggests that, in the first place, that the gross domestic product is not a very useful measure for how well we're doing. In fact, it also tells us that that all of this tremendous growth since the last 30 years has really been to no avail whatsoever. It's as if we've been spinning our wheels, and the negative consequences have been just as dominant as the positive ones. So what is it that happened around 1980 that has resulted in these three dramatic shifts compared to the previous 50 years, when it was often called the golden age, since the Second World War to 1980? A major shift occurred. And basically what we have happening is the introduction of so-called neoliberal economics. This was introduced by the followers of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. Their philosophy was, as shown here, to have a free flow of goods across nation states, a free flow of capital, a deregulation of the corporate sector, and as much privatization as possible. These are the four basic principles, and their idea was that if we follow these principles, that it will be the best for everyone. But what we see actually has happened is quite different. Some of the consequences I mentioned here. One of them is unfair competition. What the neoliberal economics does is it basically designs an international economic system that is designed for the needs of the large multinational corporations. Is not meeting the needs of people or of the environment or of smaller companies. It means it's giving the maximum opportunity for the multinationals to produce their goods in the cheapest places, in the sweatshops in Asia and South America, to get favorable treatment for tax treatment when they invest in different countries because of their tremendous size. Many of them are larger than many nation states. Also, they can use so-called transfer pricing and intercompany loans to make sure that they pay very little tax in the countries where they sell their goods. And they make very sure that the profits are accumulating in tax havens in various countries. In fact, recent statistics suggest that the richest people in the world have placed over $30 trillion worth of their wealth in these tax havens. In fact, their loyalty in many of the largest companies in the world have no longer any loyalty to any particular country. The result is of all this that it's a direct attack on the welfare state. Because the smaller companies in a place like Denmark, where I live, for example, they have no way that they can compete with these mastodons internationally who have a completely different set of rules that they have to follow. And so what the result is that we're gradually seeing more and more unemployment and more cuts in health and education and so forth. And this is a trend which is going to continue as long as the neoliberal system continues. Another consequence is that there's no action being taken on climate. The people who are running things are not particularly concerned about the climate. They figure that they'll survive no matter what happens, and they don't care that much about the rest of the world anyway. And in particular, when there's an economic setback, as we had in the last 6 or 7 years, economic growth seems to take the front seat, and climate gets put behind. Another factor which is a result of these economic models is an increasing social unrest all over the world. Ordinary citizens are more and more dissatisfied with the way things are going. So there's both good news and bad news. I would say the good news is that more and more people are recognizing the problem. And there is a so-called shift, a paradigm shift occurring. There are more and more people who are beginning to realize that we have to change our worldview, the way we look around at the world, and realize that we are all, in fact, dependent on nature. We are all part of nature. In fact, some people are calling this the Gaian paradigm because it reflects the idea that Earth or Gaia is a living organism and that we're all part of that. And if we do not take care, if we do not respect the fact that this organism has to also live, then we're going to find that we may not be part of this organism in the longer run. Gaia can survive without humans, but humans cannot survive without Gaia. So the good news is that more and more people are making this recognition. The bad news is that it's becoming more and more difficult to create real change because of the so-called corporatocracy. This is a word which was coined by the author of the Economic Hitman. And he was saying that what we have happening now in the United States is a network of large corporations and shareholders and wealthy individuals who are have basically taken control of the whole society. The Congress, by now in the United States, is very much under the control of the wealthy. It's almost impossible now to get elected to Congress without substantial financial support of this group, and even the president's powers are limited. So one of the consequences of this observation is that it's not likely that we're going to get any kind of support from, certainly not from the United States, in creating real change, and probably not from the other industrialized countries either. And so we have to be able to start thinking laterally in other possible directions. This diagram here illustrates what I mean by the corporatocracy. we see them at the very top. We have this network of large corporations and their shareholders who control the US Congress, which in turn controls the United States administration. And below them, the United States is pretty much the controlling part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank and NATO. So all of these large international organizations are pretty much an extension of the United States. And below them, we see the 7 billion world citizens who have very little say in what's going on. So this is a sort of very simplified structure of how the world actually works at this time. Now, that's been a kind of a disillusioning start with all the problems, but now I'm going to talk about possible solutions. And the first point I want to make is that we have to change the economic system. We have to throw out neoliberal economics and replace it by ecological economics. In other words, we have to put ecology first. We have to put the environment first. We have to put survival first. So everything to do with economic growth and economics in general has to come second to ecology. That's the first thing. Now, there is actually a quite well-established branch of economics known as ecological economics. So we know pretty much how to do it and what has to be done. The problem is it's been very much marginalized due to the dominance of the neoliberal thinking in all the major universities, basically. And in fact, it's not enough just to introduce ecological economics into the current system, because the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank have all been designed for a neoliberal type of society. So if we're going to introduce a new kind of economic system, we also have to have new internet. And this is one of the major points of my talk. We have to change both this economic system and the institutions if we're going to make any real change possible. What we really have to do at the nation state level in a sustainable future is we have to take back control of our economies individually. Right now, a country like Denmark, for example, has basically no control over what's going on. We have delegated the important decisions to the international speculators, to the WTO, to the IMF. There's very little we can do, and we've even delegated a lot of it in Europe to the EU also. So one thing we have to do is take back control of capital flows. One of the principles of economics that we often read about is the so-called comparative advantage, which is a nice theoretical concept, which says that countries which have an advantage in terms of, let's say, labor costs and climate and so forth, they should be able to produce certain goods cheaper than anywhere else and export them and have them as a basic income for their society. However, this concept requires that capital remains local. This is a principle that goes back several hundred years. And when we have no controls on capital flow, what happens is that the comparative advantage disappears and is taken over by the country or the countries that have the greatest capital. One example of this is, for example, in West Africa, where they have the perfect climate and low labor costs. They're the best place in the world to grow cotton. But what does the United States do? The United States gives enormous subsidies to its cotton producers in the South. And they put tremendous import burdens on cotton coming from West Africa. And particularly if it's more advanced products, like textiles and so forth, that's almost impossible to import from West Africa. So the result is that the whole idea of certain areas having a competitive advantage has in fact disappeared because of the complete free of flow of capital across borders. We also have to take back control of what goods are coming into and out of our country, not just the capital, but the goods. And one of the main problems is the international trade agreements, and the WTO in particular. WTO is a major barrier to sustainability, and I'll give you just one good example, and that is that in the WTO, there's no way you can prevent a product coming from another country to come into your country alone based on environmental standards. So if it's produced in China with very low economic standards or somewhere else that are much lower than your domestic standards, you can't say we're going to put an import charge on this in order to even the playing field. You can't do that with the WTO. This is, of course, what the multinationals want. This is part of their whole strategy. But one of the direct results of this is that it's a tremendous problem for anyone, any smaller country or a smaller company who wants to produce in a responsible way with respect for the environment and say green production and so forth. It's almost impossible to compete as long as we have to stay within the WTO. And this is one reason why change is happening much, much too slowly. The EU is also a problem. In fact, for a country like Denmark, the EU has insisted that all its member states give up their rights to control capital flows. By the way, it states in the IMF Article 6 for all countries who are members that they have the right to impose capital controls. But the EU has insisted upon member states dropping that, just as the IMF have insisted on over 100 developing countries in dropping their rights under this Article 6 of the IMF Charter. This, of course, again, is in the interest of the multinationals and not of the individual nation states. So perhaps in order to really take back control, we'll have to consider an exit from the EU and the WTO, but I'll get back to that. Let me say a few words about the ideal world as I look at it. What I would like to see happen in the longer run is that we have an organization, an international organization of nation states. I call it the Gaian League, just for reference, in which they have ceded, the member states ceded responsibility in two areas and two areas only, in sustainability and in human rights. In other words, we're not talking here about a world government. I think a world government would be a disaster. So everything else other than sustainability and human rights would be decentralized. You know, foreign policy, you name it, everything else. But why do we have these two things? Well, first of all, it's impossible to have a sustainable future unless there's some form of central control. Because some countries are always going to exploit the situation and say, well, we're not going to do it unless everybody else does it. We know the same old story we hear all the time. So this is necessary. And the second point for human rights is that we also want to have a future which is acceptable at the human level. And we don't want to have a sustainable future which is based on totalitarianism, for example. So we have to include respect for human rights at the same time. But everything else, in fact, could be decentralized. That's my ideal. I want to go on to the next chart, but nothing's happening here. Gio, are you there?
Yes, I think let me see, I think I had it. Hold on a second.
Next chart doesn't want to
There
come
it
up.
is. Is that it? I can see it in my
That's the one I'm on now.
the Gaian institutions.
Yes, I'm not seeing it on my screen.
It probably will be just a second for it to come up. I see it on mine.
You can see it? Can the participants see it?
Yes.
But then I'll just go on. I have my hand copy. So I'll talk about then the Gaian institutions. As I mentioned, we cannot change the economic system without also introducing new institutions. And in this diagram, I'm introducing a number of new institutions to my ideal society. One of the most important is a new trade organization. As I mentioned, we have to discard the current WTO organization and replace it with one which allows individual nation states to take complete charge of their capital flows and charge of the goods flows in and out of their countries. Now, the multinationals are not going to like that, but the environment is going to like it very much. Another institution I mentioned is the idea of having a clearing union, which is an idea put forward back in 1945 by John Maynard Keynes, a alternative to other forms of international trade, which is based on putting all currencies on an equal level. So no one currency can dominate the others, as is the case today with the US dollar. And I think this is an excellent system, which has never really been tried, but there's every reason to believe that it would be a very useful way of settling international trade. And I can perhaps go into more detail if there are questions on it later, but I'll just move on. I also am proposing a new kind of development bank. If we introduce if we introduce controls on capital movements, and if we introduce a clearing union, as I mentioned here, that will free up an enormous amount of money, which is now tied up in the reserves in various nation states' currencies, because they have to have these reserves in order to be able to deal with the fluctuations which occur when you have free capital flow. Once these are freed up, we can then use these funds, even in developing countries could do this alone, to finance a new kind of development bank. Now, interestingly, some of the BRIC countries have already done this. I don't know if they read my book, but this is the sort of thing I would have recommended, is having an alternative to the IMF, which is based on different principles, which is based on trying to respond to the real needs of the developing countries rather than the needs of the industrialized countries. Another of my institutions is called the Congress. This is basically a legislative body with representatives appointed by the various governments of the member states. And we have a commission, which is the executive of this organization. We have a court of justice, and we have a resource board. The resource board is basically the agency which issues environmental directives to the member states, saying you must do this, you must not do that. The same sort of thing that the EU does at the moment over for its member states. And so this is a concept which we have some experience with in Europe. And this is necessary, again, if we're going to have global sustainability, we have to all be on the same track. Finally, I have what I call a Gaian Council. This is a small body of maybe no more than 10 individuals appointed by various Earth regions. And their power is one thing and one thing only. They can veto any resolution passed by the Congress. The reason why I introduced this particular entity is that, in principle, the Congress could be taken over by a group that decided that they wanted to take charge of where the Earth was going in the future, maybe not in the interest of everybody, but in the interest of a democratic majority, much as what has happened in the United States. You know, the very wealthy have taken over the Congress. We call it a democracy, but in reality, it's being run by a very small interest group. So the point is that these people on the council could veto any such resolution which they believe was leading our civilization in the wrong direction as regards sustainability and human rights. So these people would have to be voted according to their very, very high integrity and their track record for having the first love and the first interest for the whole planet. And there are people like this in every culture. I'm not at all concerned about our ability to find them.
Russ, excuse me a second. Let me see if I can post the slides again, and maybe we'll get to the right slide. Give me a second.
Well, I can just go on talking. I can talk about the next slide until it comes up.
That's fine.
Basically, the next slide is showing the Gaian, what I call the Gaian world order, where as opposed to the current world order, we have the 7 billion people now at the top and not at the bottom. In other words, through their representatives on the Gaian Council, it is the ordinary citizens who have the last say in terms of the major decisions about where the whole civilization is going. And at the very bottom, we have these various international institutions which are controlled by the Gaian League. You know, the Clearing Union, the Trade Organization, Development Bank, Resource Board, and so forth. So now the big question is, how do we get there? Supposing we said, okay, this is a great idea. Can we envision a strategy that could get us there? And this is where I have developed what I call the breakaway strategy in my book. The breakaway strategy is very simple. It involves a small number of countries. I suspect they would be relatively small countries, 6 or 7 perhaps, who get together and say, we're going to do things differently now. We're going to form such a league officially, and the rules in that are going to apply to the initial members. We're going to have a new kind of trade agreements. We're going to have new kinds of priorities on putting ecology ahead of economics. And we're going to invite others to join us. And this is designed in such a way that, in principle, all member states in the world, all nation states in the world could become members on an equal basis. And if everybody joins together, we will have a much higher certainty that our civilization will survive in the longer run. That is the first step in the strategy. Let's join. Let's have a referendum, because these people are doing everything that we claim that we stand for. They're standing for democracy, environmental respectability, all the things that we talk about, but we never do in practice. So let's say, let's have a vote. This is basically my strategy, and that is where I would like to sort of round off my talk today and turn it back to Gio and invite questions. Okay.
Thank you very much, Russ. I'm sorry about the little problem with the slides. Somehow they were not advancing when we wanted them to, but your words were clear, and I hope everybody was able to follow that. So in the chat, if anybody has any questions, I saw that there was already a question in the chat. Unfortunately, I'm having a little problem opening it. In just a second, we should be able to get to that. Sorry about these inconveniences. Yes. Okay. It says, for me, the hardest thing in this big shift is to understand how each one living in big cities can contribute to this movement and be able to pay their bills at the same time, especially those working in huge corporations. How to plan this transition?
Well, it is a big problem in the cities because of they're designed for a completely different kind of society. But nevertheless, I would refer to the experience that we've had in the eco-village movement here and in the transition towns movement, that there are a lot of things you can do in your local neighborhood to make it a more livable society and more in keeping with the principles of the Gaian society. Obviously, it's limited how much you can do, but you can, for example, form various kinds of sharing of cars, of tools. You can clean up the streets to keep the traffic on the outside, form common grounds where you can have the children to play without having to worry about traffic and so forth. These are some of the basic principles in designing eco-villages that we talk about in the Gaia Education, and we have demonstrated over many, many years in various eco-villages around the world. It's more difficult in the big cities, I grant you, but it's not impossible. And this is, I think, the place where you have to begin. Make a so-called an eco-neighborhood. They did this in Los Angeles. They have a place there called the Los Angeles Eco-Village in the middle of the city. And I think this is the way we have to go. And sometimes you can also make a deal with some farmers outside of the city to to deliver organic food. There are a lot of companies that are doing this. A lot of places are doing this, so-called community-supported agriculture. And so I think that is the correct response if you're living in a city. In fact, it's the same response you could use in small towns as well.
Thank you, Russ. Just want to remind attendants to the participants in this webinar that the slides will be available later on. They will be posted in our SlideShare site. So you will have them, and we'll send you that link in case you miss the slides. Here's another question, Russ. It says, Amit Gulpa asks, Russ, you mentioned about equalizing the currency across. Will that really help, and how?
I think you're referring to the John Maynard Keynes idea with the clearing union. Yeah, it can help a lot because one of the big problems that we have today is that we have tremendous imbalances occurring in the international currency regime. We have a situation where one currency, the United States dollar, is dominant and is often used for settling international trade. And one of the results of this is that, as opposed to all other nations, when the United States runs a deficit, which is done for about the last 40 years, the countries who are accumulating these dollars are not selling them back as they would with any other currency. They're holding on to them because the dollar is the major reserve currency. Now, one of the results of this is that you have an artificial demand on the dollars, which keeps the price too high. And this makes the continuation of the deficit even more likely. So we get a more and more unstable situation as the more the time goes on. Now, in Keynes' idea, every country would settle not by using dollars or any other currency for that matter, but simply having a debit credit system. So if the United States trades with China, say, there would be a debit on the one side and a credit on the other, just as you have in a bank. And as long as your total debits and credits, the deficit or surplus, is within an acceptable range, and Keynes defines these quite reasonably, then you eventually, then nothing happens. So you just have it's a bit like the LET system, if you're familiar with that, this local currency system, which works on the basis that you don't actually pay cash, you work it all out with debits and credits on a computer. It's only when some country gets out of balance that penalties kick in. And so if you have too big a deficit or too big a surplus on your trade account, then you have to pay penalties. And this forces you then to retreat back until you're in the proper range again. You may have to devaluate or revalue your currency, or you may have to impose other kinds of restrictions on capital movements in order to get back into the normal range. But this would have a tremendous advantage in that it would remove one of the major imbalances right now in the world, which in principle could lead to another financial crisis at some point if everyone loses confidence in the dollar.
Great. Here's another question, Russ, from Peroso Francesco. He asks, I'd like to ask which countries can be the best to start the league, and if there is such movement roots already present.
Well, in my book, I mentioned 12 different countries just as an example of some countries which have some of the qualities which I could imagine might be of interest to such a project. And I tried at the same time to get a geographical spread and a spread in terms of religion and so on. I can mention some of them just offhand as I recall. In South America, I mentioned Venezuela, Bolivia, Costa Rica. I could even add Ecuador, I think, to that list today. In the European area, North Africa, I mentioned Tunisia as one example, Mauritius, another. In the Asian countries, I mentioned among them Bhutan, the Maldives. I also mentioned some of the smaller industrialized countries because ideally I would like to see some smaller industrialized countries as part of this. And here I mentioned countries like possibly Switzerland, possibly Norway or New Zealand. These are the countries all of which have shown some characteristics which are, part of the Gaian paradigm, one way or another. Like, for example, in Switzerland, they have a tremendous kind of responsibility at the individual level of the local cantons. They have a lot of local democracy. Other countries like Costa Rica have, for example, no army, and they have a tremendous emphasis on preserving the environment. Iceland was another example I mentioned, by the way, and they're another country which has a declared policy of becoming totally CO2 neutral and so forth. So, yeah, there are, I'm sure, many others that could be put on the list. A country like Denmark, where I'm living, you might think would be a natural candidate as well, but unfortunately, being a member of the EU is a big handicap here because Denmark could not really become a member without leaving the EU as well as the WTO, and that would be a very big step for a country who's not a member of the EU. But yeah, I'm sure others could add additional countries, but those are some of the ones I thought of in any case.
Very good. Another question, Russ, this one from Leo Caputi. He asks, we would like to know which organizations, institutions, eco-villages, etc., are creating or already experimenting a totally new economic system. How can we access this information?
A totally new economic system. I'm at a loss to give you any good examples of that. We have this experiment in northern Spain at Montagon, which has been going on for many years. It's not quite the same, but it has some of the principles. Gio, it sounds like you were going to say something. Do you have an idea there?
Oh, no. What came to mind is Damanhur Federation in Italy. They seem to have something like this, maybe not totally new economic system, but something along that line.
Well, it's true. Damanhur, some of the larger eco-villages have their own currencies. Damanhur does that, and Findhorn, eco-village at Ithaca. That is one aspect of it, is to develop local currencies that I didn't actually mention in my presentation, but that is part of the new paradigm as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe the way the question was framed, the totally new economic system is a little far reach yet. But,
yes, I think so.
But there are some experiments that are steps along that way. Another question from Peroso Francesco. He asks, if it's possible, I'd like to ask another one. Okay, how does anarchic principle of self-sufficiency and community resilience relate to Professor Jackson's roadmap for the radical economic political reform? How does anarchic principle of self-sufficiency and community resilience relate?
I would say it relates in much the same way that the eco-village movement relates, in that these people who are living in these kinds of small communities are some of the first people who are actually walking their talk and actually living the new paradigm. And as such, they're very important because they are providing examples as to how it can be done, and they're accumulating experience as to how it can be done. And if and when we have a major economic crisis, which is we're going to have if we continue on the current path, these kinds of experiments and locations can be very, very important for the mainstream to decide how they're going to react to such a crisis. For example, maybe moving into some of these places, or at least learning from them, from their experiences, as to how to go about building more sustainable communities. And of course, this is one of the major reasons why we developed Gaia Education, because the lot of the information which you need is readily available for gratis download on our website.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Those are all the questions we have. Some very good questions, actually, and very good answers as well. So I'd like to thank you, Russ, for a very informative and enlightening presentation. I hope that our participants gain some valuable insights for how to deal with the economy in a creative and positive way through the tools that you provided today.
I hope
want
so
to yes, and this is what Gaia Education is about, is facilitating this paradigm shift that we are all working towards. I want to remind everyone of the online Design for Sustainability courses offered by Gaia Education in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. They run from October to July of each year, and registration is now open for this fall semester. In fact, this is an open registration continuously. I also want to remind everybody to visit our website at GaiaEducation.net, where you can find downloads of all publications and a listing of our courses worldwide. I show you some slides. In fact, here are some of our publications, and there are also 4 keys, which are collections of essays on sustainable design as we use them in Gaia Education. This webinar, of course, is made possible by the generous donation from our many supporters. So please consider making a contribution from to make other programs like this possible. You can make a donation by visiting our website and clicking on the donate button. Our next webinar will focus on the social dimension of sustainability, and will broadcast in the winter of this year. So keep an eye open for that. You will receive an email. On behalf of Gaia Education and the Keys, I want to thank Russ very much for this presentation today, and thank you to all the participants in this webinar. Final reminder that the webinar will be posted on our Gaia Education website in YouTube, so you can watch it again. The slides will be available there as well, and we can take questions through email if there are any further questions. Any last words, Russ?
No, other than I think it's been a lot of fun, and perhaps I'm looking forward to hearing the other webinars. I know Daniel's was quite good, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yes, and we're going to be bringing up topics that relate to our curriculum. So this was one of them, and there are many, many more, at least 25 more. So we have a long time ahead.
Good. Great idea.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Russ. Hi, Hilder.